A monster the size of a house had just killed the village chief. The entire village was terrified. Everyone prayed that a powerful wizard would arrive before the beast wiped them all out. But the monster had already found its next target. A young shepherd standing alone on a mountain. The giant beast stared at him with blood-red eyes and charged forward with enough force to crush a grown man in seconds. Any normal person would have run. This boy didn't. Instead, he calmly picked up a small stone from the ground. One throw. That was all it took. The monster dropped dead instantly. Then the shepherd looked at the massive corpse and sighed. Not because he was afraid, but because now he had to figure out how to hide a dead monster the size of a house. The strange part? This boy wasn't supposed to have any power at all. For 8 years, he had hidden a secret that could change his entire life. A secret connected to ancient bloodlines, powerful wizards, and a world far beyond the mountains he called home. And the reason he was forced to hide that power began many years earlier. The story began with 2 kids playing together, pretending to be a wizard and a monster. As they argued over who was stronger and who should play the role of the wizard, their grandpa, Rabus, arrived accompanied by 2 other villagers who were looking like the guard. He remarked that the children seemed unusually energetic for such an early morning. One of the children asked what they needed to do to become a wizard. Rabus explained that wizards were apex beings who ruled over humans and stood at the top of the hierarchy. He further stated that they were nobles and knights who had inherited mysterious powers from their ancestors. Unfortunately, he concluded that the 2 children could never become wizards. A man interfered, saying that such discouraging words shouldn't be spoken to children. He then asked whether the rumors about a monster appearing near the village were true. Rabus confirmed that a leopard-like creature surrounded by an intense, pitch-black aura and shadow had been spotted near the village entrance the previous night. According to him, the creature was as large as a house. However, he reassured everyone that they all should chill because, as the village chief, Rabus had already gone to seek the assistance of a wizard. A lady present warned one of the children not to wander into the forest. Everyone knew that defeating a monster without the help of a wizard was damn hard for them. The man then wondered whether Shepherd Turan, who lived alone on the hill, had also heard about the situation. The scene then shifted to Turan, who was lying near his house on the hill, feeling bored. Having lived alone for so long, he sometimes felt as though he might even forget how to speak. Before long, Rabus approached him and remarked that he seemed to be idling away his time even under the blazing sun. Turan responded rudely, like Rabus was owing him something. Rabus then asked whether Turan was still holding on to his resentment over his mom's death and the decision to turn the ship into shared property. Turan admitted that he was not generous enough to share the inheritance left behind by his mom. Plus, he then told Rabus to leave, stating that they were not buddies for him to show such concern. Although angered by the response, Rabus informed him that a monster as large as a house had appeared nearby and that he had come specifically to warn him. He urged Turan to be careful, suggesting that he could become a target and insisting that he was genuinely concerned about his safety. Turan dismissed the warning, claiming that Rabus was far more concerned about the sheep than about him, like those sheep were costing so fortune. He then shouted at him to leave immediately. Turan was already aware that if humans possessed wizards, then beasts possessed monsters to counter them. The thought of finally seeing a wizard in such a remote village excited him. However, he was also somewhat disappointed, assuming that any wizard willing to come to such an isolated place would probably not be particularly remarkable. While lost in his thoughts, Turan suddenly caught the scent of blood in the air. By the time he reached the path, evening had already fallen. What he found there did not shock him as much as it should have. Rabus lay dead on the ground. Turan immediately recognized that the wound was no ordinary injury. It could only have been inflicted by a monster. A moment later, he sensed something behind him. Turning around, he found himself face to face with a gigantic leopard radiating a terrifying aura. The scene then shifted to the village, where a young boy asked his dad how strong monsters really were. His dad explained that if an ordinary adult like himself were to face such a creature head-on, nothing would remain of him, not even his bones. Hearing this, the boy became worried about the safety of the village. However, his dad reassured him that a wizard would surely arrive to help them and punish the monster-like wizard being a teacher. He even claimed that a wizard might be capable of killing such a creature with a single swing of a sword, like a superhero. The scene returned to Turan. He glared at the monster and shouted for it to die, but his words naturally had no effect. As the beast lunged toward him, he instinctively tried to stop it, yet nothing seemed to work. In desperation, Turan picked up a small stone and hardened it with his power before accelerating it to an incredible speed. He then hurled it toward the giant leopard with immense force. However, the attack only grazed the creature, causing minimal damage. the leopard became enraged and immediately charged at him. At that very moment, the stone that had flown past the beast suddenly curved through the air and descended from above. It struck the leopard with devastating force, killing it instantly. Turan remarked to himself that it was the first time he had ever used such a technique against a monster. Afterward, he wondered whether he should simply throw the corpse into the valley. He believed that if the villagers discovered the monster's body, they would inevitably involve him in dealing with the aftermath. In reality, Turan was a wizard who had discovered his special abilities 8 years earlier. The discovery occurred when he accidentally caused several objects inside his house to float in the air. Excited by what had happened, he eagerly showed the phenomenon to his mom. However, instead of sharing his excitement, she immediately told him to stop. It was the first and only time she had ever become angry with him. She then pulled him close and asked whether he wanted to remain by her side for a long time. Before he could respond, she urged him to promise that he would never use his powers in front of other people, nor even when he was alone. At the time, Turan was too young to understand the reason behind her reaction, so he asked for an explanation. His mom explained that only nobles and knights possessed such abilities and that they were fundamentally different from ordinary people. She told him that nobles were the descendants of those who had once saved humanity like heroes, while knights were descendants of nobles whose bloodlines had mixed with those of commoners. She then revealed that Turan was the son of a knight, and that because of his lineage, he could be treated as little more than a slave by the nobles. For that reason, she insisted that he keep his powers hidden from everyone. 8 years had passed since that conversation, and Turan had faithfully followed her instructions, like a good mama's boy. He had never revealed his abilities to anyone, nor had he used them openly. The following day, after the monster had been defeated and Rabus had been killed, several villagers arrived at Turan's house. They pounded on his door in anger. Turan calmly assumed that they had come to accuse him of Rabus's death. As soon as he opened the door, the villagers grabbed him by the collar and angrily accused him of being responsible for Rabus's murder. In response, Turan remarked that they were merely trying to frame him because they had been too frightened to confront the monster themselves and were now looking for someone else to blame. When one of the villagers attempted to strike him, Turan swiftly dodged the attack and retaliated. As the fight continued, he reflected on a peculiar aspect of his abilities. Whenever he strongly desired something to happen, it often became reality, though the effect consumed his mana. Although he had no interest in fighting the villagers, he believed that the situation was entirely their fault, as they had provoked him and chosen to pick a fight with him in the first place. After defeating all of them, Turan coldly remarked that they would have been better off using their strength to prepare for Rabus's funeral. He then noticed a group of ladies standing nearby and wondered whether they had also come to confront him. However, they quickly denied any such intention, explaining that they had only come to see him. Turan instructed them to take the injured men away. Once he returned inside his house, he reflected on the situation. He realized that his trading business might suffer because of the villagers' growing hostility toward him. Nevertheless, he resolved that if the need arose, he would use force to secure fair deals and protect his interests. Suddenly, another knock echoed from the door. Annoyed, Turan assumed that the villagers had returned and went to answer it. However, as he spoke rudely upon opening the door, he was surprised to find a complete stranger standing before him. The man politely explained that he was a traveler who wished to ask for a favor, though he acknowledged that he might have arrived at an inconvenient time. Realizing his mistake, Turan apologized and admitted that he had just dealt with several troublesome and unwelcome visitors. Noticing the sword at the stranger's side, Turan assumed that the man might simply be looking for an inn. He invited him inside as guest and offered him some food. As they conversed, the traveler expressed surprise upon learning that Turan had never met anyone from outside the village, like he was tied with the ropes in the village forcefully. Turan explained that he had been born and raised in that very house and added that it was extremely rare for travelers to visit such a small and remote village. The man commented that Turan was remarkably well-mannered and assumed that his parents must have raised him well. In response, Turan revealed that he had learned everything from his mom, who had passed away several years earlier due to illness. After some time, Turan asked about the reason for the man's visit to the village. The stranger explained that he had come in response to a request for assistance and revealed that he was a wizard. From this, Turan immediately understood that the man had most likely been summoned to deal with the monster in the area, probably at the request of the village chief. The wizard then mentioned that he had sensed the presence of a monster nearby, but had been unable to locate it. He found it unusual that Turan, despite being aware of both the monster and the death of the village elder, appeared completely calm and showed no intention of fleeing. Observing Turan's composure, confidence, and courage, especially for someone living the life of a shepherd, the wizard began to question his true identity. Hearing those words reminded Turan of a conversation he had once had with his mom when he asked why he should never reveal his powers. She had warned him that people would seek to harm him if they discovered the truth, with the nobles posing the greatest threat of all. According to her, nobles viewed knights as little more than servants or tools to be used for their own purposes. She didn't want Turan to be forced into such a life to act like slave. For that reason, she had strictly instructed him to keep his abilities hidden at all times, warning him that revealing them could ultimately cost him his freedom, or even his life. When Turan did not respond to the wizard's remark, the man dismissed it as a joke to change the topic and told him not to take it too seriously or make such a stiff expression. Turan apologized, admitting that he did not have a very good sense of humor, just like he spent his life being a foolish boy to unreveal his real powers. In response, the wizard remarked that perhaps he should be the one apologizing, as he had made Turan uncomfortable. He added that Turan's reaction had been quite entertaining and continued to tease him playfully. The man then extended his hand and introduced himself as Kiorn, a wanderer. Turan returned the greeting and mentioned that he was 18 years old. When he learned that Kiorn was around 75 years old, Turan found it difficult to believe. He wondered how someone of that age had chosen the life of a wanderer instead of settling down. Kiorn explained that he had served the Arabian family for nearly 60 years before eventually leaving their service. Afterward, he had decided to travel freely and chose not to remain in any one place for long. Turan found the story fascinating. He realized that he had never expected a conversation with a stranger to be so enjoyable. The two became so engrossed in their discussion that they continued talking throughout the entire night. By morning, Kiorn rose from his seat and remarked that it was time for him to leave. He placed an Arabian silver coin on the table, stating that it would more than cover the cost of the meal and hospitality. Turan accepted the coin and expressed his hope that Kiorn's hunt would proceed smoothly. However, Kiorn told him not to act as though they would never meet again. He added that he might pass through the village several more times during his travels and will come to visit again for sure, as they become the good buddy. After Kiorn departed, Turan headed toward his ship in an unusually cheerful mood. He felt comfortable speaking with the wizard and genuinely believed that Kiorn was a good person. Turan had always assumed that knights were emotionless and distant individuals. Because of that, Kiorn's friendly nature had left a strong impression on him. At the same time, he wondered how he could explain to Kiorn that there was no longer any monster in the hills. Meanwhile, Kiorn made his way around the hill while sensing that something was unusual. He soon discovered clear traces of a battle. However, there was no sign of any monster in the area. This led him to wonder whether the creature had already been hunted. If that were the case, he questioned who could have possibly defeated it. Nevertheless, he felt relieved. As far as he was concerned, if someone had already killed the monster, then the area was safe, and that was all that truly mattered. Suddenly, he sensed something strange behind him. When he turned around, he was confronted by a terrifying sight, a monstrous creature whose head had been completely destroyed. Kiorn was momentarily confused. Before he could fully process the situation, the monster suddenly attempted to attack him. At that moment, he realized what had happened. If the mana within a dead monster's corpse was neither absorbed nor properly dispersed, the creature could transform into a wraith-like being, continuing to move even after death. He leapt high into the air, believing that the wizard who had previously appeared in the area might have been the one responsible for killing the monster. However, he remained somewhat confused, wondering whether that wizard had been unaware that a monster could transform into a wraith-like being if its mana was not properly absorbed or dispersed after death. Despite his doubts, Kiorn decided that the matter no longer mattered. His only concern now was destroying the creature before it could cause any more harm. He immediately cast a lightning spell at the monster. To his surprise, the magic was completely nullified, and the creature vanished from sight. Kiorn frowned and wondered whether the monster possessed some form of counter-magic ability. Suddenly, the creature appeared behind him and launched an attack. Caught off guard, Kiorn failed to react in time and suffered an injury to his leg. Even so, he refused to give up. He resolved that even if he were to die, he would ensure that the monster perished alongside him. Gathering a massive amount of mana into his hand, he prepared to unleash a devastating fire spell. At that very moment, he noticed another attack streaking toward the monster. The blow struck the creature and forced it to stagger backward. Turan had arrived. He immediately asked whether Kiorn was all right. Kiorn was genuinely shocked. For someone he had assumed to be nothing more than a simple shepherd, Turan's actions were far from ordinary. It was only then that he finally began to understand the truth. Turan was a wizard. The realization left him stunned. He briefly wondered why Turan had chosen to hide his identity for so long. However, instead of dwelling on that question, he focused on a more immediate matter. He asked why Turan had come to help him when he could have simply walked away and left him to face the monster alone. In response, Turan reminded him of a conversation they had shared the previous day. He recalled asking Kiorn why he was willing to go so far for the sake of the village when he did not even know what reward the village chief had promised him in return. Considering Kiorn's abilities, he could have earned far more money elsewhere and enjoyed a much more comfortable life. At the time, Kiorn had explained that the villagers were pitiful people living on the frontier. They spent their lives surrounded by danger and lacked even the most basic protection, like they were kicked out of the kingdom, whom no one is noticing. He had stated that those who inherited the power of the gods, the wizards, should take pride in protecting the weak and powerless. However, Kjorn had also admitted that not every wizard shared his beliefs or sense of responsibility. Turan then pointed out that everyone had their own way of living, subtly challenging Kjorn's ideals and suggesting that no single path was correct for everyone. Before the discussion could continue any further, the monster launched another attack. Kjorn swiftly dodged and immediately warned Turan that the creature was far beyond their level. In his opinion, they could not hope to defeat it unless they possessed power comparable to that of a noble. He urgently told Turan to leave at once, inform the village chief about the situation, and help evacuate the villagers. As for himself, he intended to remain behind and hold the monster off for as long as possible. As Kjorn prepared himself for what he believed would be a desperate and dangerous battle, Turan calmly remarked that if his previous attack had connected properly, the fight would have already been over. The statement left Kjorn speechless. For the first time, he began to suspect that Turan had been concealing far more than just his identity. Perhaps he had been hiding his true strength all along. The realization sent a chill down Kjorn's spine. The person standing before him was no longer merely a young man he had happened to meet in a remote village, nor was he simply a rebellious youth hiding from the nobles. What stood before him now felt like something entirely different. Turan then released his power without hesitation. As his mana surged outward, he calmly remarked that he himself was curious to discover the limits of his own strength. Kjorn did not allow Turan to act recklessly, believing that their opponent was far too powerful. He was about to suggest that they join forces and proceed cautiously, but before he could finish speaking, Turan suddenly charged forward and launched an attack. Kjorn immediately realized that he would never be able to keep up with Turan's speed. He knew that he would be unable to react to attacks of that caliber and would only become a load. Therefore, he decided that the best way he could contribute was by supporting Turan and allowing his talent to grow and show to others. However, as Turan continued his assault, it became apparent that his attacks were ineffective. Kjorn then explained that a wraith could not be killed through ordinary physical attacks. Turan soon discovered that even fire and lightning were not producing the desired results. This led Kjorn to wonder whether Turan had been the one who had originally killed the monster and had unintentionally allowed it to become a wraith by failing to absorb its mana. If that were true, it would mean that Turan had never absorbed mana before in his life. Kjorn quickly instructed Turan not to merely create fire and throw it, but to properly shape and control it before releasing it. Turan followed his instructions. Kjorn knew that while creating fire was relatively easy for a wizard, controlling it required separate training and discipline. Yet, to his astonishment, Turan grasped the concept almost instantly. As Turan launched another attack, Kjorn urged him to remain focused like a good sharpshooter for its aim. He explained that Turan needed to continuously channel mana into the flames so that they would not dissipate and could completely burn the wraith. Understanding this, Turan persisted, despite the immense difficulty. After a prolonged struggle, they finally succeeded in defeating the wraith. Kjorn was stunned by the outcome. He knew that defeating such a creature normally required a wizard of noble rank, yet Turan had managed to accomplish it. He then advised Turan that if he wished to avoid creating another wraith, he needed to absorb the mana from the corpse before leaving. When Turan appeared unfamiliar with the process, Kjorn demonstrated it and instructed him to follow the same steps. As Turan complied, he began to sense a green aura flowing throughout his body. Kjorn could hardly believe what he was witnessing. Even though he saw it with his own eyes, he found it difficult to accept that this was truly Turan's first time absorbing mana. Kjorn knew that after a person's awakening, their mana generally increased gradually with age. However, the most effective way to strengthen one's mana was by killing monsters or other wizards and absorbing the mana they left behind. While lost in these thoughts, Kjorn eventually asked Turan which noble house he belonged to. Turan ignored the question and instead asked Kjorn to wipe the blood from his face first. Afterward, he brought him back to his home and treated his injuries. Kjorn apologized for causing so much trouble, but Turan replied that he had already said many times that he was not someone important. He described himself as nothing more than a poor shepherd who did not even know anything about his dad, and asked Kjorn to stop addressing him in such a manner. Kiorn found it difficult to understand why someone like Turan would refer to himself that way, as it seemed completely out of character. In response, Turan explained that it had been his mom's final request before her death. She had warned him that there were no safe places for someone like him beyond the mountains. According to her, because he was a wizard, people would only seek to use him and would discard him once he was no longer useful. Kiorn agreed, remarking that Turan's mom had been a very wise lady. Turan was surprised, having expected Kiorn to dismiss her words as overprotective parenting. Instead, Kiorn affirmed her concerns, explaining that great power, especially the power possessed by wizards, inevitably attracted conflict. He then recalled a great war that had occurred around 20 years earlier between two powerful noble houses, the House of Arabian and the House of Zahar. Thousands had perished during that conflict, including nearly everyone dear to him. His son, his wife, his teacher, and many of his friends had all lost their lives in the war. Because of those experiences, Kiorn believed that Turan's mom had been correct. However, he also felt that she had underestimated Turan's potential. Though it was somewhat embarrassing for him to admit, even as a skilled knight, he had been unable to defeat the monster that Turan had destroyed with such ease. From that alone, Kiorn concluded that Turan's talent far surpassed that of an ordinary knight. He estimated that Turan possessed aptitude comparable to that of a noble house member, perhaps even one belonging to the upper ranks of the nobility. This caused Turan to question whether his mom's claim that his dad had been a knight was actually true. Kiorn admitted that he could not say for certain, but he suggested that it would be better for Turan to leave the mountains and experience the outside world for himself. Kiorn explained that humanity still had not become the true master of the world. Although many other races had been driven away long ago by the gods, they were still waiting for an opportunity to return and reclaim their place. At the same time, the noble houses continued to wage endless wars against one another just for the position first, which surely not just stay with one family always. Because of this, Kiorn believed that the world desperately needed strong and compassionate nobles like Turan. He also sensed that Turan was not truly content with the life of a shepherd. As Turan grew uncertain about his future, Kiorn spoke about the countless possibilities awaiting him beyond the mountains. Wealth, fame, authority, family, friendship, and companionship. All of these could become his if he chose to pursue them. Kiorn encouraged him to think of himself as an explorer, venturing into an unknown world filled with opportunities. As they stepped outside, Turan found himself agreeing with Kiorn. The prospect of exploring the outside world seemed far more exciting than spending the rest of his life herding sheep. For the first time, he felt genuine curiosity about what lay beyond the mountains. Kiorn even offered his support, and once again asked about Turan's bloodline ability. Turan looked confused, prompting Kiorn to apologize for forgetting that Turan was unfamiliar with such concepts. Kiorn then explained what a bloodline ability was, and asked whether there was any spell or skill that felt unusually natural or effortless for him to use. Turan replied that there was nothing particularly special about him. He merely possessed an exceptionally keen sense of smell and happened to be very good at throwing stones. Kiorn found this answer intriguing, as those traits resembled characteristics commonly associated with the House of Arabian. However, the more he thought about it, the more another possibility emerged in his mind. As their conversation continued, Turan noticed that Kiorn's expression had suddenly changed. Curious, he wondered what had caused such a dramatic reaction. Kiorn then revealed that he believed he had finally identified the noble house most closely connected to Turan's abilities. According to him, the traits Turan had described matched those of the great house known as the Pursuers, or Hunters, House Zahar, the very same house that had once stood against the House of Arabian in the Great War. Upon hearing that, Turan felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. He began to wonder whether he truly shared the same bloodline as the enemies of Kiorn's family and elders. Confusion filled his mind, and he questioned whether he should apologize to Kiorn. However, before he could say anything, Kiorn told him not to make such expressions. He explained that Turan had never participated in that war, and that it had been a conflict belonging to the previous generation. Kiorn further stated that if people continued trying to wash blood with blood, such conflicts would never truly come to an end. Turan then asked whether Kiorn regretted encouraging him to leave the mountains after learning about his possible heritage. In response, Kiorn admitted that once Turan entered the outside world, he might eventually join House Zahar and rise through its ranks due to his extraordinary abilities. Even so, Kiorn made it clear that he trusted Turan's character. He explained that he had already witnessed Turan's kindness firsthand, as Turan had been the one who saved his life. Rather than fearing the possibility, Kiorn believed that if someone like Turan were to join such a powerful noble house and attain a high position, he might be able to prevent tragedies like those of the past from happening again. Finally, Kiorn advised Turan not to dwell too much on the matter. After all, Turan had not yet decided whether he would join that house or not. Turan then declared that he had decided to leave the mountains. However, he intended to do so only after Kiorn's injuries had completely healed. Until then, they would remain there together. Once they returned inside, Kiorn began teaching Turan about mana. He explained that mana was the fundamental source required for the use of magic. As the lesson continued of a teacher and a student, Turan raised a question, being the good student, regarding how a wizard determined the appropriate amount of mana required for different spells. Kiorn replied that he would explain the subject in greater detail later. For the time being, however, he stated that the difficulty of using magic was determined by three primary factors: bloodline, affinity, and causality. He explained that bloodline was particularly important among nobles who were not knights. As an example, Kiorn stated that it would be extremely difficult for Turan to heal his wounds through magic. However, for someone born into a bloodline such as Revista, performing such healing magic could be effortless, even without formal training. Moving on to affinity, Kiorn compared it to the way Turan had naturally formed a fireball. The process had seemed as simple and instinctive as throwing a stone. This suggested that Turan possessed a natural affinity for that particular form of magic. Turan found the explanation reasonable, and Kiorn further elaborated that if Turan had lacked such affinity, he would never have been able to create and control flames with such speed and power. Finally, Kiorn began explaining causality, though he admitted that it was by far the most difficult concept to understand. To illustrate the idea, he asked Turan what would happen if he attempted to kill him directly using magic. Turan speculated that a flash of light would probably appear and that the act would be completed instantly. Kiorn confirmed that this was precisely where the problem lay. He explained that such an outcome represented a disruption of causality, as there was no proper cause capable of justifying the desired effect. In other words, attempting to produce a result without establishing the necessary process or conditions would violate the natural order governing magic. In such cases, the magic would either fail entirely or require an overwhelming amount of effort and skill to succeed. As Kiorn continued his explanations, Turan gradually began to understand these principles. While demonstrating some of his abilities, Turan received praise from Kiorn. However, Turan pointed out that he could easily control ordinary animals at will and questioned why influencing magical beasts required such complicated conditions. Kiorn explained that the difference lay in mana. Unlike ordinary animals, magical beasts possessed their own mana, which naturally resisted external interference. Because of this, controlling them was significantly more difficult. As their discussion continued, Turan came to realize that magic was far more complex than he had originally imagined. Curious, he then asked whether the Zahar bloodline possessed any special magical abilities. Kiorn replied that members of House Zahar were particularly gifted in stealth and tracking. He then encouraged Turan to attempt using such an ability himself. When Turan tried, he wondered whether anything had actually happened. To Kiorn's astonishment, Turan had successfully concealed himself from sight. Moments later, he reappeared. Kiorn explained that the ability was not true invisibility, but rather a specialized form of concealment. He then offered to teach Turan proper methods of magical training. Turan found it somewhat strange that Kiorn was willing to teach so much to someone who might belong to the bloodline of his former enemies. Like, what if Kiorn was having some dirty trick going on his mind to give backstab to Turan? In response, Kiorn explained that Turan had saved his life and cared for his injuries. Because of those actions, he trusted Turan's character completely. Sometime later, Turan went to meet the village chief and informed him of his decision to sell his old ships and leave the village. The chief felt deeply offended, especially in front of the villagers who were preparing for the shiphead ceremony. He questioned how Turan could make such an important decision without consulting the rest of the community. Turan calmly replied that it was a personal matter and not something that concerned the entire village. He added that he hoped the villagers would purchase the ships at a fair price. Otherwise, he would simply release them and leave, forcing the villagers to manage the situation on their own. Although many of the villagers were angered by his words, they had little choice but to comply. In the end, they paid Turan for the ships and allowed him to depart alongside Kiorn. Before leaving, Turan remarked that the villagers still owed Kiorn compensation for everything he had done for them and suggested that he should collect it. However, Kiorn refused, insisting that Turan was the one who truly deserved any reward. Eventually, the two reached a point where they had to part ways. Kiorn apologized for declining Turan's offer to travel together, explaining that he felt more comfortable journeying alone. In response, Turan thanked him for everything he had done and expressed his hope that they would meet again someday. Both men smiled before finally going their separate ways. As Turan continued his journey alone, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Over time, he began to regard Kiorn as a role model and someone worthy of admiration. While crossing a desolate stretch of land, Turan noticed a group of people in the distance. At first, he assumed they were traveling merchants who moved from village to village and thought it might be worthwhile to approach them. After making his decision, he walked over and asked for directions to the nearest city. The travelers informed him that if he followed the road from which they had come, he would eventually arrive at the city of Murray. Turan thanked them and prepared to continue on his way. However, one of the men suddenly questioned whether Turan intended to leave after receiving help without offering anything in return. The man remarked that it was only proper to repay a favor when one had benefited from another's assistance. Moments later, several of the men drew their swords and demanded that Turan hand over his belongings. At that instant, Turan realized that they were not merchants at all, but bandits. Their leader casually remarked that some might call their actions reckless, but in the wasteland, no one found it unusual when people disappeared or died. Remembering Kiorn's warning that bandits would not hesitate to kill, Turan immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. With that realization, he decided that this encounter would serve as an opportunity to test and refine his newly learned magic. As the group attempted to provoke a fight against a beast like Turan, they questioned why Turan was speaking in the manner of a wizard. Before they could react further, Turan suddenly unleashed a powerful gust of wind that sent them all flying backward. At that moment, he realized that he had no choice but to engage in the battle. Soon afterward, he gathered several stones and launched them with tremendous force. The stones pierced straight through one of the men, causing Turan to realize an important principle. It was not merely the nature of the material that determined its lethality. Even water, if propelled with sufficient speed, could become powerful enough to penetrate the human body. The leader of the group immediately became terrified. He admitted that they had never expected Turan to be a wizard and began pleading for forgiveness, offering him anything he desired in exchange for mercy. However, while the leader was speaking, several of his subordinates attempted to attack Turan from behind. Without even turning around, Turan pressed his foot against the ground. Instantly, sharp stone pillars erupted from the earth and impaled the attackers. Having no desire to prolong the encounter, Turan questioned why they had attacked him so recklessly. He pointed out that he had been traveling alone and could easily have been a wizard. The bandits explained that they had assumed he was an ordinary traveler because he had bowed his head respectfully when greeting them. Turan calmly acknowledged their reasoning. The leader, still trembling with fear, wondered whether Turan intended to spare their lives. However, before he could feel any sense of relief, he noticed that another attack had already been prepared above him. At that moment, Turan remembered Kiorn's warning. Kiorn had told him that he would encounter many dangerous individuals on his journey and that he should never show mercy to bandits. According to Kiorn, sparing a single criminal could eventually lead to the suffering of countless innocent people. With those words in mind, Turan finally abandoned his hesitation. He concluded that he had already delayed long enough. After the encounter ended, Turan resumed his journey. Nevertheless, his thoughts remained unsettled. He had taken lives, and although a part of him felt guilty, he understood that allowing the bandits to escape might have resulted in far greater harm. In the end, he realized that Kiorn's advice had been correct. Eventually, Turan arrived at a new region. In the distance, he could see the towering walls of Murray City. Excitement filled him as he entered the bustling city and witnessed such a large crowd for the first time in his life. It's like a newborn baby get toys for the first time. The architecture was vastly different from anything he had seen in his village, and he gradually began to understand what life in a city was truly like. Seeking guidance, Turan approached a fruit vendor. The man impatiently asked what he wanted, as Turan seemed hesitant and uncertain. Remembering Kiorn's advice, Turan decided that his first priority should be finding an inn, since every settlement typically had one. When Turan failed to purchase anything immediately, the fruit vendor rudely told him to leave. Confused by the man's attitude, Turan instead pointed toward the fruit and asked about its price. The vendor informed him that it cost 2 ducats. He also remarked that Turan appeared to be an outsider and added that it would not matter if he used a different type of currency. After paying for the fruit, Turan asked for directions to the nearest inn. The vendor provided the information, and Turan soon arrived at the establishment. Inside, he was greeted warmly by a staff member named Lena. She welcomed him politely and even complimented his appearance. Might be she is trying a chance to make him as her man. Turan, without any delay, inquired about the cost of staying for a single night. Lena informed him that a room would cost 16 ducats per night. After hearing the price, Turan agreed to stay at the inn, and Lena appeared unusually delighted by his decision. While handing over the payment, Turan asked whether there were any monsters nearby that carried bounties. He remembered Kiorn's advice that hunting monsters would not only allow him to absorb mana, but also provide a source of income. For a brief moment, Lena did not respond. She then remarked that nothing in the world came for free. She explained that if he wanted information regarding bounties and monster hunts, he should visit the city hall, where public affairs were managed under the authority of the city lord. Since it was already late, she added that the office would most likely be closed and that he would need to return the following day. Lena then asked whether Turan was a monster hunter, mentioning that many hunters eventually became wizards. At that moment, a man named Medan approached and casually placed a hand on Turan's shoulder. He confirmed that it was indeed possible to become a wizard through hunting monsters, claiming that he had personally witnessed such cases. Lena expressed surprise that Medan was still alive. In response, Medan confidently declared that he had no intention of dying before becoming a wizard himself. He went on to explain that wizards grew stronger by killing monsters and absorbing their mana. According to him, even an ordinary person could eventually become a wizard by following that path. Medan then introduced 3 companions who were traveling with him and pursuing the same goal of becoming wizards. After examining Turan's appearance, Medan remarked that his equipment looked rather shabby for a monster hunter and asked whether he even possessed a proper weapon. In response, Turan showed him a sling and explained that it was effective for launching objects roughly the size of an egg. Although somewhat confused by the answer, Medan nevertheless invited Turan to join their group. However, Turan politely declined the offer. Later that night, as Turan lay on his bed, he reflected on everything that had happened throughout the day. The experience had been overwhelming, and he still found it difficult to fully accept that he had truly left his village behind. Thoughts about his uncertain future continued to weigh on his mind. Suddenly, a knock echoed from the door. Remembering Kiorn's warning that even cities were not completely safe, Turan immediately became alert. Preparing himself for the possibility of danger, he cautiously approached the door and opened it. To his surprise, the visitor was Lena. She remarked that the room might become cold during the night and explained that she had come to keep him warm. Turan, however, failed to understand what she meant. Nevertheless, he could not help noticing the unusual excitement reflected in her expression. Lena approached Turan in a suggestive manner and offered to fulfill any of his desires in exchange for a small amount of money. However, Turan refused. Like, how the hell any boy is going to refuse such an offer? He really is a dumb guy. He remembered Kiorn's warning that the maids and prostitutes working at inns might carry diseases, and that he should avoid such temptations and never fall into their traps. Irritated by his rejection, Lena left the room without another word. As Turan lay on his bed, he began to feel that the city was cold and indifferent compared to the village. The warmth and kindness he had once known seemed completely absent in this unfamiliar place. At that moment, he overheard voices coming from outside. Medan was speaking with his subordinates, who questioned why he had been willing to invite Turan to join their group. In response, Medan revealed that he intended to use Turan as bait when confronting monsters. He explained that since Turan appeared somewhat capable, he would likely survive long enough to serve that purpose. Hearing their conversation, Turan quietly reflected on their words. Rather than feeling shocked, he came to a realization. Perhaps the city was not merely cold-hearted. It was far more dangerous than he had originally imagined. The following day, Turan visited the city hall and informed the officials that he had come to hunt monsters. As he spoke, he recalled something Kiorn told him. The world would not treat him kindly. From another perspective, he understood that there was no reason for strangers to show him kindness in the first place. If he wanted respect, the easiest solution would be to reveal that he was a wizard. The official at the counter handed him a poster and instructed him to examine it carefully because it would not be taken back once assigned. The target was a crow-type monster. The official spoke rudely and emphasized that Turan had to bring the monster's corpse back to the city. He explained that if a wizard failed to disperse the mana remaining within a monster, it could transform into a wraith. Furthermore, leaving a slain monster outside the city was a crime punishable by execution. Turan was already familiar with these regulations. He then asked why the knights did not hunt monsters themselves. The official scoffed at the question and replied that the knights were responsible for maintaining order within the city rather than wasting their time hunting monsters outside its walls. He implied that such work was meant for people like Turan. Sometime later, Turan returned carrying the corpse of the crow monster. The employees at City Hall were visibly surprised and wondered how he had managed to complete the task so quickly, especially if he had done it alone. After receiving his reward, Turan noticed that people were still staring at the corpse in disbelief. Without hesitation, he requested another monster hunting assignment. Over the next few days, Turan continued hunting relentlessly. By the third day, he had defeated 30 monsters and earned a considerable amount of money. That evening, when he returned to the inn, Lena served him one of the most expensive dishes available. She remarked that she had never expected someone like Turan to appear, let alone accomplish such incredible feats in such a short period of time. Although Turan had earned a large amount of money, wealth was never his true objective. His real goal was to collect mana from the monsters he hunted. At one point, he wondered whether Lena had secretly taken a bite of his meal. She immediately denied it and pointed out that he had eaten everything himself. Despite his slim build, he possessed an unexpectedly large appetite. In response, Turan simply remarked that the food was delicious. The cook then came out personally to express his gratitude and promised that he would prepare an even better meal the next time Turan visited. However, the atmosphere suddenly changed when two men approached and grabbed Turan. They mocked his thin frame and questioned how someone like him could eat so much food while earning such a large amount of money. Having heard about his recent success, they demanded that he share some of his earnings, claiming that it would be a form of charity for his so-called partners. Without any warning, Turan punched one of the men and asked whether that was the kind of charity they were demanding. The situation quickly escalated into a fight, but it ended just as swiftly, with Turan defeating both men effortlessly. Lena immediately shouted that fighting was prohibited inside the inn, forcing everyone to calm down and bringing the incident to an end. Soon afterward, Medan arrived with his companions. He sincerely apologized to Turan and assured him that such an incident would never happen again. He explained that they had been struggling financially and that his subordinates had become jealous after seeing how much money Turan had been earning. Medan then admitted that they were unable to pay their lodging fees and would likely be forced to leave within 3 days. Upon hearing this, Turan gave him some money, explaining that it was repayment for the kindness they had shown him earlier. In return, Medan once again invited Turan to join their group. However, instead of accepting the offer, Turan requested information. Medan agreed without hesitation and shared everything he knew, as he spent every penny of his money over someone who was going to return so big thing. He even provided details about the next city Turan could travel to after leaving Murray. As time passed, Turan came to understand Medan better. Unlike Kiorn, who was experienced and cautious, Medan lacked the same level of experience. Nevertheless, there was a certain sincerity and kindness in him that Turan could not ignore. One day, while out hunting monsters, Turan decided that it would be his final hunt in the city. He had already gathered enough information and resources to continue his journey. Later, as he stood on a cliff overlooking the city, he suddenly sensed that something was wrong. Reacting immediately, he rushed toward the source of the disturbance. There, he found a man who had been severely injured. Upon closer inspection, Turan recognized him as one of Medan's companions. Moments later, Turan noticed a few scattered coins lying near a lifeless body. It was Medan. Turan stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend how events had unfolded in such a tragic manner. Turan had heard someone mention a rabbit-type monster, although he initially suspected that it might have been a lie. However, he soon spotted the creature nearby. Without warning, it lunged at him, and he barely managed to dodge the sudden attack. Realizing that he had an opportunity to counterattack, Turan attempted to strike the monster with his power, but the rabbit swiftly evaded the attack. As it charged toward him again, it suddenly became confused when Turan vanished from its sight. In the next instant, he reappeared behind the creature and launched a series of attacks from the rear. Turan then leaped onto a nearby tree, but the rabbit relentlessly pursued him. Just as it was about to attack, he disappeared once more, forcing the creature to continue chasing him repeatedly. After a long and intense battle, Turan finally succeeded in defeating it. As he absorbed the monster's mana, he sensed that it was somewhat different from any mana he had encountered before. The sole survivor of Medan's group realized that Turan was a wizard and wondered why he had concealed his identity all this time, like he is a frontbencher who had the capabilities of a backbencher, but hides that. Turan then asked whether any of the deceased had family members to whom he could deliver their belongings, but the man refused. At that moment, Turan recalled a conversation he had had with Medan the previous day. Medan had spoken about a city called Aurum, which was also known as the Library because it housed thousands of books. Remembering this, Turan became interested in visiting the city. However, he had also learned that access to the library was restricted and that only wizards were permitted to enter. Setting those thoughts aside for the moment, Turan buried the deceased and remarked that he was heading to Aurum, hoping that they would rest in peace. Without further delay, he set out on his journey and eventually arrived at the great city of Orem. He had not expected to find such a massive crowd gathered at the entrance. A long line of people stretched before the gates as they waited to enter the city. Upon noticing the guards, Turan wondered whether they were searching for criminals. When his turn finally arrived, he was stopped at the gate. The guards initially refused him entry because of his unusual clothing, which they claimed they had never seen before. They instructed him to clean himself up before attempting to enter the city again. After some effort, Turan eventually gained entry. He soon found himself standing before the Grand Library and was overwhelmed by its immense scale, like every student feel their life will become after passing from 12th grade. Politely, he informed the guards that he wished to enter the library. However, they explained that only wizards were allowed inside. When Turan stated that he was a wizard, the guard immediately became angry and questioned whether he had a death wish for making such a false claim. The guard insisted that someone like Turan could not possibly be a wizard. In response, Turan demonstrated his power. The display forced the guard to step back in shock. He immediately became frightened, sensing that Turan was no ordinary wizard and was likely of noble rank or perhaps even higher. The man then introduced himself as Kenya, a knight of House Veltas, and asked about Turan's affiliation. Turan asked whether revealing his identity was necessary in order to gain entry. Kenya replied that it was not required for entry itself, but explained that access to the library would require permission from the master of House Veltas. After the matter was settled, Turan was escorted to take a bath. To his surprise, several attendants began assisting him, leaving him both confused and uncomfortable. He asked them to stop and wondered whether it would be a problem if he bathed by himself. The attendants explained that they would be punished if they failed to properly serve an honored guest. Sometime later, after Turan had finished bathing and changed into clean clothes, he noticed that several of the maids were blushing while looking at him. Confused, he wondered whether there was something wrong with his face. The maids quickly explained that they had simply been stunned by his appearance and apologized for their behavior. When Turan responded casually, they politely requested that he not speak so informally to them. Shortly afterward, a young lady arrived and questioned whether Turan was the same person who had appeared earlier looking like a beggar. She remarked that after bathing and changing his clothes, he looked completely different and resembled a prince rather than a wandering traveler. Turan introduced himself, and the young lady identified herself as Azella. She then asked about the house to which he belonged. Turan replied that it was difficult to explain. Azella interpreted his response as either hesitation or an attempt to conceal his background. Finding the situation somewhat amusing, she decided to test him. Releasing a portion of her mana, she asked Turan to demonstrate his own mana as well. When Turan unleashed his power, everyone around him was left stunned as how cool things they just saw, while Azella was deeply impressed by what she witnessed. To his surprise, she suddenly proposed marriage to him. Turan reacted with confusion, causing Azella to turn away and remarked that she had only been joking. Nevertheless, she added that he should consider the idea at least once. As she departed, Turan noticed that his hands were trembling, exact when a weak boy is standing against a stronger man. At that moment, he realized that Azella was far stronger than he had initially assumed. Later, Turan met with the Lord of Orem, Rug Valtas. Rug welcomed him warmly and asked whether he wished to use the library. He mentioned that many people had recently been visiting because of strange rumors circulating about the place. However, he clarified that the library contained neither ancient magic nor any secret method capable of increasing Turan's mana. Turan replied that he had no issue with that. Rug then assured him that none of the books within the library contained information considered confidential to House Valtas. He also requested that Turan return the following day, as it was already late. The next day, Turan was granted access to the library and was immediately astonished by the vast collection of books it contained. A lady wearing oversized clothes like the priestess of church approached him and introduced herself as the librarian. She explained that she would guide him through the library's rules. According to her, he would be required to compensate for any damage caused to the books or facilities, and he was strictly forbidden from taking any books outside the library. She also informed him that she would be observing him throughout his visits. Turan politely asked her to stand a little farther away because her close presence made him uncomfortable. He then wondered aloud whether she also read the books stored there. The librarian replied that she did, and even offered to help him find the most suitable books if he wished. She asked what type of books interested him, and Turan explained that he simply wanted to learn the basic knowledge of the world. The librarian brought him several books and explained that many of them were hundreds of years old and might not perfectly suit his needs. However, she pointed out a smaller section of the library that would likely be more useful for someone seeking fundamental knowledge. As Turan began reading, he quickly became engrossed in the books. He continued visiting the library regularly and learned about various races, geography, equipment, weapons, relics, and even monsters from ancient times. As a result, his knowledge expanded significantly. One day, while speaking with Rug, Turan was praised for making excellent use of the library's resources. Rug explained that granting him access to the library had been an act of goodwill and that he had chosen to place his trust in him. However, he also admitted that he hoped to receive something in return for that goodwill. Turan asked what it was that they wanted from him. Rug revealed that there was a monster he wished Turan to hunt. He further stated that, in exchange, he would fulfill any reasonable request Turan might have. Although Turan understood that protecting people and eliminating dangerous monsters was part of a wizard's duty, he could not shake the feeling that something about the situation was not quite right. One of the most important trade routes had been blocked for nearly 10 days. Turan realized that the problem had begun even before his arrival in Orem and understood that this was likely the true reason he had been granted access to the library. After some time, Turan set out to hunt the monster, accompanied by Azella, Marvin, and several soldiers. Along the way, Azella wondered why her dad had assigned a guest to deal with the problem when their own people were capable of handling it. A boy walking beside her remarked that calling the Lord Fuzzy was going too far. He then introduced himself as Marvin and explained that he would be working alongside Turan during the mission. As they continued forward, Marvin asked Turan whether he had any interest in Azella. Turan immediately denied it. However, their conversation was interrupted when they heard a strange noise ahead. Upon investigating, they discovered a destroyed wagon and quickly concluded that the monster was nearby. After examining a set of footprints, they began to suspect that the creature might be some type of monkey. Based on the tracks, Turan deduced that the monster had attacked the peddlers before retreating into the forest. He believed that if they followed the trail carefully, they would eventually locate it. Azella mentioned that she had rarely used tracking magic and asked Marvin whether he could manage it. Marvin also declined, admitting that he lacked experience with such techniques. Turan then explained that he had used similar methods many times before and decided to track the creature himself. As he concentrated, he suddenly sensed something and pointed in a particular direction, signaling the others to follow him. However, after traveling some distance, they arrived at a river. Azella questioned whether Turan truly believed that a mere beast had gone to such lengths to avoid detection, even washing away its tracks in the water. Turan replied that the creature had likely acted on instinct and simply done whatever was necessary to survive. Moments later, Turan suddenly remarked that something was behind them. Without warning, a gigantic monkey-like monster emerged and began hurling massive stones at the group. The soldiers struggled to evade the attacks, and many were struck by the projectiles. Turan, however, managed to avoid the assault. Amid the chaos, he noticed that Azella and Marvin were using the soldiers as shields to protect themselves. The sight reminded him of his mom's warnings and made him realize that her words had not been wrong. As the surviving soldiers prepared to launch a counterattack, the monster abruptly turned around and attempted to flee. Reacting instantly, Turan picked up a stone and hurled it with remarkable precision. The projectile struck the monkey directly, causing it to stagger. The display of strength and accuracy left everyone present completely stunned. Seizing the opportunity, Azella launched her attack and struck the monkey-like monster with her flame dragon technique. With that, the group felt a wave of relief, believing that the monster had finally been defeated. They praised Turan for his skill, and he teasingly asked Azella whether she had been frightened during the fight. Soon after, their attention shifted to the injured soldiers. Observing the scene, Turan felt that the situation had become unnecessarily chaotic. He reflected that although it had been a surprise attack, such severe injuries could have been avoided. He also noticed that Azella and Marvin were significantly stronger than the knights, yet they had not hesitated to use the weaker soldiers as shields. This realization left a bitter impression on him. While Turan was quietly observing them, both Azella and Marvin noticed his gaze and wondered whether something was wrong. Turan denied that anything was troubling him. Azella then suggested that they proceed to absorb the monster's mana. As they began absorbing the mana, Turan noticed that the degree of enhancement did not seem to diminish over time. After a while, Azella and Marvin reached their limits and could no longer absorb any more mana. However, Turan continued absorbing it without stopping. This surprised both of them, as they realized that Turan possessed not only great strength, but also exceptionally high potential. By the time they returned home, evening had already fallen. Marvin remarked that it was thanks to Turan that they had managed to defeat the monster so easily, from tracking it down to handling the battle itself. However, Turan dismissed the praise, stating that there was nothing particularly remarkable about what he had done. Instead, he expressed regret for failing to notice the monkey monster's surprise attack earlier, which had allowed it to strike first. The others were surprised to learn that the monster had also possessed tracking abilities. As they continued walking, Turan explained the creature's traits and behavior in detail. Marvin was astonished that Turan had managed to figure all of that out in such a short period of time. Turan explained that he had learned about it from an encyclopedia of monsters. Both Marvin and Azella commented that the library was a rather suffocating place. Azella admitted that she had once visited it out of curiosity, but had left shortly afterward when she saw that it was filled entirely with books. Turan suggested that anyone looking for something easier to read could simply ask the librarian for recommendations. At the mention of the librarian, Azella appeared confused, as she had never heard of anyone managing the library. Later, when Turan returned to the library, he began to wonder how the librarian had known his name, since neither knights nor commoners would normally address a noble so casually. When he asked her about it, she simply smiled and remarked that he had finally noticed. She explained that she had learned his name from his permit and that, as long as someone was within the library, her awareness extended throughout the entire building. When Turan asked for her name, she revealed that she did not have one. She then offered him several beginner-friendly books. Turan suddenly became much more polite, which made the situation somewhat awkward, especially considering that he had been casually ordering her around for days. As she continued acting clingy, Turan gently pushed her back and asked her not to behave that way. He wondered whether she was some strange being from the old empire, but she denied it, explaining that she was not human at all, but a spirit. She further revealed that she was essentially the library itself, and that the form she had taken existed solely for communication, shaped according to the user's preferences. To help him understand, she compared herself to a reflection in water. When Turan attempted to touch her, his hand passed right through her body. He apologized, believing that his action might have been inappropriate, but she instead expressed frustration over her inability to act directly against intruders. She mentioned that someone had once taken books from the library without permission, yet she had been powerless to stop them. She went on to explain that no one until now had possessed the qualifications necessary to perceive her. According to her, her creator had designed the library so that only individuals whose bloodlines had reached a certain degree of completeness could see her. Curious about this, Turan asked her about bloodlines. She suggested that he ask his parents instead, but Turan revealed that he was an orphan. Upon hearing this, she decided to examine him and requested his permission to do so. Although her behavior made Turan slightly uneasy, he eventually agreed. After establishing a connection with him, she discovered that he possessed both fragments and significant portions of a hunter's bloodline, which she identified as a characteristic of the Zahar house. Upon further examination, she sensed another bloodline within him and concluded that he was of mixed heritage. However, that bloodline remained sealed and would naturally awaken as he grew stronger. Her words reminded Turan of his mom and her kindness, prompting him to express his gratitude to the spirit for helping him. From that point onward, Turan no longer spent his time reading alone in silence. Instead, he frequently asked the spirit to explain the contents of the books. Through her guidance, he learned about many unseen and intangible phenomena and gradually came to understand fundamental principles such as the refraction of light and the generation of heat through friction. One day, while experimenting with a fruit, he attempted to rot it through magical manipulation. To his surprise, he realized that such effects were not beyond the scope of ordinary magic. Rather, understanding the underlying principles enabled him to achieve the same results while consuming far less mana. As a result, his abilities as a wizard improved significantly. He began to suspect that the great noble houses were monopolizing knowledge and maintaining their superiority by keeping such understanding hidden from others. The spirit reflected that people's level of knowledge had been declining over time and remarked that she now understood the reason behind it. Eventually, the day came when Turan prepared to leave the library, as the Lord had subtly begun hinting that his stay should come to an end. The spirit asked him to take her along, but when Turan questioned whether she was capable of leaving the library, she admitted that she could not. Instead, she asked him to remain there, explaining that the library still contained many divine legacies that he had yet to explore. However, Turan declined, stating that he would return from time to time. Although the spirit appeared saddened by his decision, Turan reassured her that there were still many books he had yet to read and promised that he would definitely visit again. With that, Turan departed from the library. His next destination was Zahar, where he hoped to uncover clues about his parents. On the way, Turan did not rush and continued his training at a steady pace, taking proper rest whenever necessary. After some time, he heard a disturbance and noticed a horse fighting against several monsters while trying to protect its owner. Nearby stood two strange figures who appeared to be observing the scene. Their appearance was unusual, with purple-colored skin that set them apart from ordinary beings. One of them attempted to create an opening while the other prepared to launch an attack. Turan wondered whether they were dark elves, the same race rumored to have summoned numerous monsters. He hesitated, unsure whether he should intervene. However, his hesitation quickly turned into shock when he saw one of the elves eating a human hand while telling the other to eat her share as well. The female elf caught the severed hand without hesitation. At that moment, Turan realized that they were cannibals. Suddenly, the female elf noticed that her companion had become the target of an attack. In response, she commanded all the surrounding monsters to gather around her. Sensing that the attack was coming from a particular direction, she ordered the monsters to move toward it. She then summoned a wolf and instructed it to unleash its power in the same direction. By then, Turan had already been exposed. As the monsters began advancing toward him, he formed fireballs in his hands and launched them at the approaching creatures. However, the attack was not effective against all of them, and one of the monsters managed to strike him. Amid the chaos, Turan realized that the summoned wolf had already bitten his leg. While he was occupied fighting the monsters, another creature took advantage of his lowered guard and injured him as well. The elf confidently declared that she would soon make him beg for his life. At that critical moment, the horse suddenly charged forward, attacking the monsters and disrupting their formation. Seizing the opportunity, Turan launched a powerful counterattack. He managed to strike down the female elf, killing her instantly. With her death, all the monsters she had summoned vanished as well. Although victorious, Turan had suffered severe injuries. The horse quietly approached him, and he expressed his gratitude for its timely assistance. As night fell, the horse's rider finally regained consciousness. He found himself lying near a bonfire while Turan sat nearby, eating a meal. Confused, the man asked who Turan was. Turan replied that he was the person who had rescued him from the dark elves. The man then suddenly noticed the horse, Tilly. Relieved to see that his companion was safe, he thanked Turan for saving both of them. He introduced himself as Aziz of Hausberg. In return, Turan introduced himself and asked whether there was any particular reason Aziz had come into conflict with the Dark Elves. Aziz explained that he had been on a pilgrimage with his retainers when they were suddenly ambushed without any provocation. He admitted that he had always heard that other races were savage, and as he recounted the incident, he became emotional and apologized for having believed such assumptions. Turan asked whether the people who had died were his family. Aziz clarified that they had been his knights and servants, the very people who had raised him since childhood and accompanied him on the pilgrimage. Turan then inquired whether Aziz knew how many dark elves had attacked them, mentioning that he had killed 2 of them. Aziz replied that those 2 had been the only dark elves involved in the attack. To verify this, Turan extended his senses and searched the surrounding area. However, he found no trace of any remaining dark elves. Aziz then asked whether Turan had any urgent business to attend to. Turan responded that he was also traveling on a pilgrimage. Aziz found it unusual that Turan was journeying alone and remarked that considering his strength, he must belong to a great house. Knowing that it would be difficult to explain his circumstances, Turan downplayed his abilities. He stated that he was not particularly strong and had only managed to ambush one of the elves. As for the second elf, he had barely managed to defeat her with the horse's assistance. At that moment, both Turan and Aziz unconsciously released their auras. Aziz was surprised by the intensity of Turan's aura and wondered why someone possessing such power was also traveling without companions. Aziz then suggested that if Turan did not have a fixed destination, he would be welcome to accompany him to Hausberg. He offered to repay Turan for saving his life and escorting him safely back. He further explained that Hausberg was known as the Enchanters of the North and the Vessels of Arabian. It was a great house with a long and prestigious bloodline that had been crafting magical tools for generations. As a token of gratitude, Aziz offered Turan one of Hausberg's finest magical tools, assuring him that it would be worthy of someone with his abilities.